Hey there, my name is Peyton and I'm going to show you how to make your first simple patchwork quilt on your home sewing machine. I'll be making a quilt to match this precious book, The Little Ghost Who Was a Quilt. Let's get started. So what you will need is fabric. You can choose to purchase fabric by the yard and cut your fabric up, or you can do what I did, which is the easier way. You can buy pre-cut fabric. This is called a charm pack, and this is what I'll be using for this. A charm pack is a pack of 5-inch squares. There's 42 of them. It's 42 coordinating fabrics. I ordered this from Missouri Star Quilt Company. Those are one of my go-to stores, as well as Fat Quarter Shop. You'll also need some backing fabric. I'm actually going to use just a fleece blanket for my backing fabric, and the amount that you'll need for that totally depends on the size quilt that you want to make. Mine's going to be just a child size throw. You'll also need some batting, and this is going to be the center layer of your quilt. Plenty of sewing pins, coordinating thread. It can be all-purpose thread or it can be quilting thread. Sewing needles, it can be universal. A cutting mat, 6x24-inch ruler, seam ripper for mistakes, sewing scissors, lots of safety pins, basting spray, a walking foot, an iron and an ironing board, rotary cutter, heat and bond, and binding fabric. So the first thing that we're going to do is lay out our quilt squares however we want them. And you can make this as big or small as you like. I am lucky enough to have a design board that my father-in-law built for me, but you can use the floor or the kitchen table if you need to. And honestly, this part always takes me a while. So once you have all of your quilt squares laid out exactly how you want them, I highly encourage you to take a photo so that you can reflect back when needed. So now it's time to sew your squares together. So what we're going to do is on the first row, we're going to take the second one and put pretty side to pretty side together. And we're going to sew down this side right here. So I'm putting the second square on top of the first square, right sides together, and then I'm just going to pin along the line where I'm going to sew. And here you see me doing the very next row and the next row. I'm going to go ahead and pin all of these and just have them ready so that I can chain piece, and I'll show you how that looks in just a moment. Now I keep my walking foot on my sewing machine at all times, but you may have a regular foot and that's totally fine. So I'm getting ready to sew right down this line where the pins are. I'm lining up the inside outer edge of my walking foot to get that 1/4 inch seam allowance. And here we go. Here's a close-up of trying to get that 1/4 inch seam allowance. I hope you can kind of see where I'm pointing. I've got the inside outer edge, if that makes sense, lined up. If you have on a regular foot, you could just match up to the outer edge of that. Put your needle and presser foot down and sew. No back stitching, and just lift up your presser foot, and with your needle down, just put your next set of squares up there to sew down that right side. And since I'm a little more confident, I actually did not keep these pinned. Now I'll just cut the threads in between. Let's press our seams open. So I'm just finger pressing, opening up those seams, and then I'm taking my iron and pressing those open. Notice when I place the iron on that seam, I am pressing and not moving the iron around until I'm on the squares themselves, not on the seam. Pressing, not ironing. Because if you iron it, you're probably going to stretch that seam. Look how nice it already is beginning to look. Once I sew all of my blocks together in 2s or sometimes 3s when required, I'll just put them up on my design board. You can choose to sew your pairs of blocks in rows like I'm showing you there, but I'm going to be sewing mine in 4 patches like I'm showing you here. I feel like that gives greater accuracy. Okay, so now that we've got all of our seams ironed, we are going to make our first 4 patch. So what we're going to do is we're going to line up these seams right on top of one another. So I'm going to take my top 2 blocks and flip them over the bottom 2. And I am just going to try to line up these seams as best as I possibly can to try and get them absolutely perfect. And this, I am absolutely going to pin. And I always start in the middle, because if we can get that middle seam just right, we'll be set up for success. And I can already see that my fabric on this one is a little bit hanging over the edge. We're not as worried about that as we are getting these seams lined up. Okay, now I've got my seams matched up the best that I can, and I'm just going to sew down this side. Again, I'm chain piecing, which is sewing more than 1 block at a time. Okay, moment of truth. How did we do? Pretty good. And look, whenever you iron this, when you press this seam open, it's going to look even better. Look at that. How pretty. Now, let's say that we got the seam right, but you had some extra fabric hanging off of one of these edges, don't sweat it. We'll just use a ruler and cut it with the rotary cutter. Here's an example of a block where the seams are nearly perfect, but there's still some fabric hanging over the edge. So I'm just lining up my ruler with the shorter of the blocks, and I'm also going to line up one of the center lines, horizontal lines on my ruler, with the center seam going across before I cut. And I'm just going to turn the block until I can get it as even as possible on all sides, and I'm lining up the center of the ruler with the center seam. So once you have all of your 4 patches, or maybe some are 6 patches, let's sew those together. So I'll take the top 4 patch and lay it right on over the next 4 patch, just like that. Line up those seams just like we were, pin. Always pin this. And I'm just checking to see if my seams are matching up, and they weren't, so I had to undo the pins and redo them. This can be time consuming, but if you get them nearly perfect now, you'll love the result. If needed, trim before you pin. Match up those seams. Continue to sew your blocks together. Continue to press those seams. I pressed mine open. You could press yours to one side, but I just love the way that it looks whenever you press your seams open when possible. It gives such a nice finish. Now, when I am trying to pin more than 2 seams, I like to try to start in the middle and get those seams as accurate as possible first. I feel like I get a better outcome that way. And you can see that I'm constantly peeling the fabric back to try to make sure that I'm getting these seams matched up as much as I possibly can. I cannot always get them perfect. And I am going to go ahead and pin beyond where the seams are, like on the actual block, just to continue to hold it together. Again, I will pin the center seams first for accuracy. Here you can see how I chose to sew my blocks into sections, and then I decided to sew the top sections all together and then the bottom sections all together so that I would only have one long seam to have to try and line up when I was pinning. Otherwise, if I had sewn the 3 tops to the 3 bottoms, then I would have 2 long seams that I would have to try to pin and match up that many squares at one time, and that's just a little harder to do. Here you can see what I was talking about, sewing the top half together and then the bottom half. And there's my finished quilt top. Now all I have to do is add the face of the ghost. This next step is optional for if you are creating a ghost quilt like I am. To create the ghost face, I'm going to use the Heat and Bond Ultra Hold. I'm using the type that is made for dark fabrics, but you could use the regular clear kind if you have that on hand. You draw your shapes onto the paper side of this, and then you iron it on your fabric, and then you cut your shapes out. I cut a little piece out for my face, and I'm just showing you the back side is the black side, and of course if you got the clear kind, it will be white. So I'm just going to draw my face. And remember, anything you draw, it's going to be backwards from how it looks here. I'm getting my fabric ready. Pressing this onto my fabric. Make sure you're pressing on the paper side. Then it's time to cut the face out. I actually cut out a little bit on the outside of the eye circles. I felt like they needed to be a little bigger. Then I just trimmed them up. And there it is. So now you peel off the paper part and see how it's shiny on the fabric. That's the back side that's going to stick to the quilt. So what I did is I actually pinned these to my quilt top to make sure they were in the place that I wanted them in first. And I'm just going to begin pressing these to the quilt and taking the pins out once I get everything just how I want it. Want to make sure this stays in place, especially since it's a little face. I'm making sure to get every little wrinkle out that I possibly can. Did I mention that you don't have to sew this if you don't want to? It'll stick with the heat and bond. Now beware, if you touch this, it is hot, and I actually burned my finger right there when I tried to make sure that the ends of the smile were glued down. Once your quilt top is complete, go ahead and give it a nice press all over and clip any loose threads on the back. Oh my goodness, the quilt top is going to be so cute. So now I'm just going to put my cutting mat up under the quilt top, and I'm just trying to straighten up the edges of the quilt as much as I can. Technically, you could kind of skip this and just wait until you get your batting and all underneath, but I wanted to go ahead and get it as squared away as I could. Now it's going to be time to put these quilt layers together. So I'm getting my batting. I'm using the Pellon natural cotton batting from Walmart. There's no need to buy the most expensive batting out there for your first quilt. This works just fine. So I'm going to spread out my batting on a clean surface. Could be a large table. I always get on the floor. I'm going to smooth out my batting as much as I possibly can. Then I'm going to get my backing fabric and peel off any loose threads that might be on it, because they may show through, especially if you have a light colored backing fabric. If they get stuck in between that and the batting, they'll show. And once I get that laid on top, which is harder than it looks, I'm going to just, as you can see, pull it back in sections, or fold it back in sections rather, preparing to spray baste. So smoothing that batting and fabric out once again, and I'm just going to use spray in sections about this wide to make my backing fabric and batting stick together. And just in these small sections, I'm going to smooth out that fabric as quickly as possible and try to get any bumps out that I can. And if I mess up, I'm going to go ahead and try to pull that fabric up and separate it before it dries too well. Now, I don't necessarily recommend the spray glue that I am using. This is not technically basting spray, so when I tell you it sticks, it was really not as friendly as regular basting spray whenever I did mess up and had to pull the fabric back. And so I do this on both halves of the batting. And this is a small quilt, so I probably could have done one half at a time. But see, that little bump I tried to fix. Here's where I made a huge mistake. I got to talking and I put my quilt top right on top of my backing fabric, and that is not how it goes. So guess what I got to do? I got to pull up my very glued down quilt top, and then my quilt backing had glue all over it and stuck to the floor. Isn't that fun? Don't do what I did. So now that I have my quilt top on the correct side of the batting, I'm separating it, folding it back into sections, and spray basting. Once I got that done, I got out my safety pins and I started to pin every other quilt block. And I actually did start in the corners, but I did not show that. Now it's time to trim the bulk of the batting and the quilt backing. Some people may not agree with this step necessarily. They may leave their backing fabric hanging over the edge, especially if they're going to take their backing fabric and use it as their binding, but that's not what I'm doing. So I'm just going to leave probably 3 inches or so of batting and backing fabric around the edges. Aw, isn't he so cute? It's almost time to quilt. So we're going to roll each side of the quilt toward the center, and I'm just going to use these garage clamps to help hold it in place after I roll it. I'm rolling it in small sections and then clamping it to help just hold it together. This is especially helpful for a larger quilt. I didn't technically have to do it for this really small child-sized throw. And this is preparing to quilt the quilt down the center. We begin there because it can shift, the fabric can shift. Apply your walking foot to your sewing machine if you haven't already. So I just put my quilt over my shoulder. That's the best way that I have found to have control over the quilt as I am sewing. I like to increase my stitch length by 2 to make it easier to sew through more layers. And I've got the inner outside edge of my walking foot lined up with the seam to create about 1/4 of an inch stitch line from the seam. And you can see that I'm just kind of picking up the quilt to help glide it through. I'm not pushing it, of course. You can see how I'm just helping it along. And I do stop from time to time to reposition the quilt or smooth out any wrinkles. And I do have my needle in the down position so that anytime I stop, it easily picks up where it left off. And since this is a small quilt, I'm sewing down each side of the seam, but you can quilt yours however you like. And next I'm showing you how I have readjusted the roll to be open to the next seam that I need to sew down. Don't forget to put your presser foot down before you sew. It's helpful if you're able to put a little table in front of your sewing machine to offset the weight of the quilt coming down so that your stitches can be more even. I did not sew through the eyes and the mouth. I stopped and then backstitched once I got to either the eyes or the mouth, and then I started again once I got beyond the other side of it. It feels so satisfying once you finally get to that last line to quilt down. Yay, now my quilting is complete and it's time to take the pins out. Sometimes it's easy to miss some and I don't find them until later. I also try to clip loose threads as I find them. Hopefully your quilt will not have as many loose threads on the back as mine did, because don't forget, I still had spray glue all over the back of mine. Now it's time to trim down the quilt to the quilt top. So I'm lining up the edge of my ruler to the edge of the quilt top. And this makes me really glad that I did try to even up my quilt top before I quilted it. This part to me is always so satisfying. For my binding fabric, I'm just using some blue fabric that I already had in my stash. It's probably less than half a yard. And I just folded it in half. And I'm going to square up this edge as much as I can before cutting my binding strips. You can tell my rotary cutter is getting a little dull. And I don't worry about which way the fabric stretches. I just cut the strips how I want to. It's never ended up being too big of an issue that I couldn't work out as I went. I cut 2 1/4 inch strips for mine, I believe. A lot of people cut 2 1/2 inch strips, but I prefer a skinnier binding. There are quilting calculators online that you can use to configure exactly how much fabric you will need for your binding and your backing and all of those things. But I don't use any of that. I just try to guesstimate, and I try to guesstimate a higher amount. It never hurts to have a little too much, especially with binding. You could also order 2 1/2 inch strips that are pre-cut online. So to connect my binding strips, I'm just going to lay one flat right side up and the next one right side down on top of it. Draw a diagonal line from the top left corner to the bottom right corner always. Once I'm done pinning this one, I'm going to take the bottom of that strip and put it right side up and put the next strip right side down on top of it. Draw my line, top left to bottom right, pin, and then take the bottom of that strip and connect the next one. Then I'll take it to the sewing machine. I will make sure to put my needle down because I am planning to chain piece these just like I did with the quilt blocks. So presser foot down and needle down, and I'm sewing down that line, pausing that stitch to do the next one. And just make sure that you put your needle down into the fabric before you start sewing a new one, so that it doesn't try to fold under into your machine. Clip the joining threads. Okay, so we've sewn down our lines. Now it's time to open those up, check them out, make sure they're correct, and then we're just going to trim the excess off. And I don't normally use a ruler, I just kind of go for it. Always check before you trim, just to be on the safe side. So we'll press the seams of our binding as well. As you can see, I'm just folding the binding strip in half and then ironing that. And we'll do that all the way down the binding strip. Now it's time to put the binding on the quilt. I like to put the binding on the back side of my quilt, and I'm going to kind of start it near the center of the bottom usually, and I'm just going to pin it down. Now the raw edges are on the same side as the raw edge of the quilt, so raw edge to raw edge. And I actually should not have begun pinning there. I want to start my stitch length about right there where that circle and arrow is. I will want to leave a tail on the binding. Now when we get to the corner, this can be kind of tricky. I'm just going to fold it to where it's giving us a nice diagonal line toward the corner of the quilt. Then I'm going to fold it back down on top of that, and I'm trying to get that fold pretty even, like a straight line at the top, and then I'm going to pin, and I will show you this again. So we're back at our corner. We're going to fold it diagonally toward that corner, and we are taking our time doing this and then folding it back over, trying to get that top fold as straight as we can. And you see I really had to kind of play with this one to get it. I don't know if you can tell, but it definitely works better if you can get it to where not that much fabric hangs over the diagonal edge. I don't know if that makes sense or not. Okay, so I should have left an open space about that far where I put those yellow dots, but that is not what I did. But I did leave a tail at least. Again, because I want to leave a tail, I'm not going to begin sewing until that first pin. And you can see how I lined the presser foot up just like I pretty much did everything else with this quilt. Don't forget to increase your stitch length also if you haven't. Needle down and back stitch. And I'm stopping periodically to make sure that I can get my pins out in time, and also to straighten out the binding fabric. It kept kind of bunching up and making a little hill. Now the corners can be kind of tricky on this as well, so I'm just going to unfold the fold I have, open it up, and I'm going to sew down that diagonal line. I'm going to sew to that line where the fold is, stop with my needle down, and I'm going to reposition the quilt to where the corner is facing me the best that I can, and I'm going to sew down into that corner. Hopefully you can kind of see that. fold it back over. I did lift up my needle, and now that I've rearranged the quilt, needles back down, and I'm just gonna backstitch and sew. Don't worry, I will show you this again. Okay, so I messed up my own binding on this quilt and had to redo it. So this is just an example. So let's say that we have gone and we've sewn, we backstitched here, sewed around the quilt, came here, backstitched, and now we've got our opening. We want our binding strips to overlap in the center as much as possible. So boom, boom. Now we want the top piece to overlap the bottom piece the amount that our binding is wide. So my binding on my quilt was 2 1/4 inches. My binding for this right here, this example, is only 1 1/2 inches. So I want this to overlap this 1 1/2 inches. So we are going to measure, and we are going to pull this kind of taut. So we're going to measure from right here pulling kind of taut 1 1/2 inches. So let's see. Again, on this, it's 1 1/2 inches, but on my real quilt, it was 2 1/4 inches. Now, in one video I watched, she said to cut right there. I'm terrified to do that because I have messed up binding too many times. So I'm just going to leave my mark there, is what I'm going to do. And I'm going to open that up like that right there with the top side showing. Now watch me carefully, because this is where I keep messing it up. Instead of opening this yet, I'm just simply going to, just like this is, straight across, bring this with the raw edge over to my marked line. Then I'm going to open it up, and then I'm going to sew across our triangle up top. And we're praying, Lord Jesus, please let this be right. Because I really don't want to have to do this again. Okay. Hallelujah. It's right. So now we just need to trim this excess off. Please trim the correct side. You will cry. All right, and now we're just going to sew across that line right here. Now it's time to pull the binding over the top of the quilt, and I'm just showing you here how to create a nice mitered corner. It doesn't always turn out this well. You'll see that some of the corners I really have to play with to get them to look as good as possible. We're pinning all the way around, and another thing you can do is take clear Elmer's glue and put little dots up under the binding and then iron it down, and your binding will stay put while you sew. With my stitch length increased and my needle down, I sew, and look how close I'm sewing to the inner edge of the binding. And I'm coming to a corner, so I'm going to stop sewing when I get to the very edge of that top piece at the mitered corner. I'm going to keep my needle down, lift my presser foot up, and turn the quilt. Place my presser foot back down and then continue to sew down the other side of the binding. And I almost forgot to add my label tags, so here I am. I decided to just go ahead, since I'm just now remembering, and slide my label tag that says Made with Love by Peyton Dean under that binding edge on the front of the quilt. I ordered mine from Etsy, but I know that Amber at Crafty Chaos could hook you up with this. And as we finish sewing on this binding, I'd like to thank you for watching my video and sewing with me. Final back stitch and you're done.